I appreciate the invitation to talk here. When people ask me if I do reinforcement learning, I say no. And then, because I don't do reinforcement learning, it's certainly mostly in the way that most people do reinforcement learning. But if we take a kind of broad view where we say, well, I'm interested in systems that learn from experience to do better at something, then I totally do reinforcement learning. So I want to talk about that, but in a kind of a different style. In particular, I want to talk about rational learning. So, okay, so my goal in life is to make intelligent general purpose robots, robots that are as good as you. And it's hard because there's enormous variance in the problem, because the horizon is really, really long, the state space is really big. And so if you compare the kind of typical problems that people often frame and think about as machine learning or RL problems, then this is a bigger problem, generally speaking. And classically, the way we've thought about, let's say, humans making decisions in complicated domains is in terms of rationality. So just a reminder, what do we mean by rationality? We say, well, an agent's rational if it takes actions that in expectation will tend to achieve its goals or get a lot of reward. Realistically, we can only ever be boundedly rational, but this is a principle that really guides the field. But I want to dig into it and think about where the rationality lies. Okay, so I have this little robot that's going to make comments during the talk. I should also say that although this is like some keynote thing, I'm happy if someone just feels burning desire to talk back, you're welcome to do that. And I'll try my best to leave time at the end. Okay, so the kind of the most standard view is sort of the view I take when I stand back and I say, okay, my job is to be a robot factory. I'm going to try to make robots, not the hardware part, that's an important part, but mostly not what I do. I'm going to focus on the software part. My job is to make robots and put software, some program, policy, pi in the head of my robots, such that when they go out into the world, whatever world they go out into, they'll perform well. So I want to think about this mapping, this policy that takes the history of states and observations and actions into the next action and maximize some measure of future reward. And I could think about that decision theoretically, right? You all do, right? In expectation over the domains that the robot might find itself in, it should act in a way that's going to get a lot of reward. And if you write this down this way, what's awesome is that we don't have to argue with each other really at all. Right? That is, given a distribution over worlds this robot has to operate in, there is an optimal or a family of optimal policies, and they will do learning and estimation, or they will do what they need to do in order to be optimal in the domain that they're in. But man, we're the engineer, and it's a really hard problem. Even if you have a spec, it's a really hard problem to figure out what is the optimal program to put in the head of the robots. Right? That's what all of you guys are doing, probably, and me too. Okay. So I would say that the standard way right now that most people think about this problem is what I would call design time rationality, or rationality in the factory. The decision theory is happening in the factory. So the way we think about that, you could think about this, you could say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a big simulator, which has actually got samples of the distribution over situations this robot might find itself in, make a big old domain. And I'm going to make a very totally general purpose, because we value general purposeness in our mechanisms, learning algorithm. And I'm going to couple those things together and train it for absolutely ever. And it's going to achieve AG robot intelligence. So that's the view, right? Maybe that's the view. And it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's simple. It doesn't have a lot of moving parts. Seems good. I would argue maybe evolution did something like this for you, but me personally, I don't think it's the right way to do it right now as the engineer in the world. And so I'm going to talk about an alternative strategy. So, because I want to do this thing in the short term, well, short term, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, but, plausible term. And I want to take advantage of everything I can in order to make this happen. And so in particular, I want to take advantage of the structure of the physical and social world. I want to take advantage of what we have all learned from computer science and math about learning and algorithms. I want to use accumulated cultural knowledge. I want to reject the bitter lesson. There's Rich right there. I have a story about Rich at the very end, don't worry. Okay, I love Rich and the world but love the world you're with. Okay, that's a song reference that only old people will recognize. The idea is here we are in this actual physical world, and it's okay. It's okay to just agree that we live in the physical world we live in and maybe take advantage of that fact. And okay, if putting some hypotheses ahead of some other ones in the list doesn't mean that you couldn't possibly eventually, in the limit of absolute time, learn anything in the world. But I really don't think that that's probably critical. Okay, so what do I believe? Here's my beliefs, my credo. Okay, I think there is an external physical reality that has some nice sparsity and locality properties. I think that independent structure in computational problems often gives us leverage for efficient computation, efficient learning, and so on. I'll dig into these things in detail as we go. And I think that causal models of transitions and observations are likely to be the place where we get the most leverage from the sparsity and locality of the properties of the world. Okay, so I want to make general purpose robots. I want to start by building in some algorithms. I want to train some models that are pretty general purpose and compositional. I want to be able to improve them over time. And I want to do runtime rational inference. So I'm going to put the rationality, the reasoning about goals and objectives in the head of the robot, not so much in the head of the engineer. Okay. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the strategy makes systems that are easier for humans to understand and prove things about. Maybe it's more like the way humans work, and maybe humans would have more affinity with systems that are built this way. I don't know for sure, but those are some possibly useful side effects. Okay, so I want to make a rational robot factory. That is to say, I want to make a robot factory where the rationality mostly lies in the head of the robots that we're producing. Okay, so in this talk, I am going to show you some pieces of a research agenda that I have had over the last several years. They don't all hang together. I wish it was all like one thing and it could like stand up and walk here and give the talk for me or something, but that is absolutely not true. But they're little pieces and parts that I think maybe at least give me some faith that this agenda is a plausible strategy. Okay, let's start with the first thing. Okay, those of you who've worked on PSRs and so on reject the idea that there is an external world and there's nothing but observations and actions. But me, I actually believe in the world. I like probably, it's a thing. Okay, so I believe there's an external physical reality. You don't have to, but I do, and I would like to take advantage of that. And that used to not matter so much because perception was terrible. But something that's happened in the last few years, and is happening at an incredible rate, is that large pre-trained models for doing computer vision have become awesome. And not the part that tells you whether something is an anaconda or a butterfly, but things that now can really build awesome reconstructions of 3D scenes. So I'm just going to show you an example of one piece of work from my lab, but lots of people are doing this. It's an incredibly rich field. But I just want you to look at this. So this is a thing that takes a single image with unknown objects, and builds a really decent 3D reconstruction. Okay, that's the whole message of this thing. Single image, awesome 3D reconstruction. And if you could make a pretty good 3D, of course it's not perfect. There's a bunch of things wrong. But if you can make a 3D reconstruction from a single image, then that's a physical reality that you can really deal with. Okay, so that's it. Believe in physical reality. We're going to get better and better perception models. Okay, so if you believe in the physical reality and you think that we can build algorithms that can actually recover it or recover some aspects of it from observations, then maybe we can leverage that. Okay, so now I want to think about a representation of policies, which everybody is, of course, familiar with, but maybe secretly doesn't love as much as I do. Or maybe you do. I don't know. But let's talk about it. So I want to talk first about policies. Okay, here's the thing about a policy. A policy contains in it, and especially a policy that's implemented like as one feed-forward pass of a neural network, it contains the answers to all possible problems. Right? That's what it means to be a policy. Like it covers the territory. But think about all the possible ways the world could be. Your world. Think about all the possible ways the world could be. and think about what fraction of those possible ways the world could be that you will encounter. It's measure zero, right? All the things that can happen, what you will experience. They're just just not incommensurate, right? But if you say, I need to have a feed-forward policy that to address all those things, then you need to cover everything that could happen. Okay, I just think that's nuts, right? Okay, I'm sorry. Let me say it more politely. Okay, so what's the alternative? The alternative is to kind of hang on a minute, don't solve all those problems in advance offline, and do some reasoning online in order to decide what to do. Okay, so good. So we can trade off some computation at runtime for this giant pre-computation offline. And there's a lot of interesting theoretical work that kind of gives us some ideas that it's not just intuition that this is a good idea. So there's some things that show that, for instance, stuff that you can represent in a feed-forward pass or autoaggressively might require much more data to learn than representations that can do reasoning. That the circuit complexity for general purpose policies for planning problems can be very, very big. So the circuit complexity, again, it's a circuit that could solve every possible problem. But if you allow yourself to reason, you don't have to solve, you don't have a circuit that's capable of solving the worst case instance. You can make the easy cases easy. Right? That's another important thing, right? If you're doing the computation online, if it's an easy problem, you can do a little computation. If it's a hard problem, you can do a lot of computation. If you have to make one thing that does all the computation, then it may have to be as complex as the worst case. There's some interesting work about how actually if you try to learn a general purpose goal condition policy, it's implicitly going to have a world model in there anyway, and maybe the world model is simpler. And you might say, if you're one of those people who complains about things being slow, I can say, okay, that's fine. Just take all the training examples that you get when you're planning and put them in a cache or a neural network or an amortized whatever, and you can have a partial policy that covers the cases that you're likely to keep revisiting. Okay, so that's an argument for planning. So let me show you just what you can do with planning. So this is a policy for a robot. The only machine learning in this policy is in the perception part. And this was a couple of years ago now, so that the perception learning is woefully out of date because the thing is moving fast. But the ideas are still good, right? So the way this policy is implemented is that it takes, okay, first of all, if you just defocus your eyes, it looks like a normal policy in the sense that images come in and motor torques go out, but it has some internal structure. And the internal structure is that we observe a scene, we do some reconstruction, we decompose the scene into objects, we estimate properties of the objects. We take in a goal description from a human. Originally, it was in first-order logic. Now it can be in language because an LLM can translate. We put those things into a planner. The planner produces a plan. We execute the first step of the plan on the robot, look to see what happened, and repeat. Okay, so it's a policy, but it's implemented using a planner. And I just want to show you that it's like kind of cool. Okay, completely novel objects, right? So this thing doesn't need to know what objects it's gonna see in advance. And the only learning, I say this to students and they like think I'm like lying or cheating or something when I say the only learning in the system is in the perception. The only learning in the system is in the perception. Okay, so here's an example. This is my favorite example. I'm gonna actually stop the video after a minute. Some of you have seen this before. Okay, so this is a robot. It can only see from its perspective, so I can't see from our perspective. We put the objects on the table, and it was given the goal of putting all the objects on the blue mat. This robot is not so smart. It's actually not reasoning about its own uncertainty, which I'll come back to at the very end if I have time. But what it sees is the cracker box, and it says, well, okay, I see something. I'll put it on the blue mat, makes a plan to do that. Oop. Okay, so it thinks for a minute, makes a plan, puts the object on the mat. Then it takes another look and it says, oh, snap. I didn't get all the objects on the blue mat. There are these other objects. And so then it just makes another plan and puts the objects on the mat. Okay, so no learning, just planning. Right? And it can do this because it understands objects in space and 3D and kinematics and all these things. And using all that general knowledge about how the world works, it can figure out what to do. So I don't think we need to learn to do that. Like, I think I know how to write a program to do that. And it's a pretty general purpose program. And we can do all sorts of other stuff. Put each object in the bowl of the closest color. This one is kind of entertaining. Put all the objects on the blue mat. Turns out that more and more objects happen as it tries to do this, but eventually it persists, puts everything where it's supposed to go. Oh, and this is a joke for robot learning people, but people like to talk about cross-embodiment generalization. That just means that it can work on a different robot. But if it's doing reasoning about kinematics and geometry, it doesn't matter what the robot is, so that works too. Yay, okay. Good, so let's believe in physical reality. If you have a model, right, a model of how the world works and a planning algorithm, that's another way to implement a policy, and it might have some advantages, in particular with respect to generalization and sample complexity. Okay, but let's think about what kind of representations we should learn, right? So let's say we say, all right, planning, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe I should learn I love how world model now has come to mean specifically a transition model, I think. Okay, so let's learn a transition model. But let's think about how to do that. Okay, so if I want to learn efficiently, I gotta have a compositional representation. It has got to be that I can learn about calculus, and I can learn about navigating, and my calculus and my navigating don't interfere with each other. It's just gotta be like that. It can't be that everything is all stirred together, right? So we have to figure out a way to learn pieces and parts that can assemble so that we can kind of be much more efficient in our learning. Okay, von Humboldt, make infinite use of finite means. Or we can make the combinatorial explosion work for us. So, okay, so let's say we're gonna have a world model for planning. And the question is, what should it be like? And I would like it to, number one, be sample efficient. Like more than anything in the whole world, I want it to be sample efficient. I also would like it to be able to be incrementally learnable so that I can learn new things. It doesn't interfere with the old things. And it should afford efficient reasoning. But I actually don't mind if I have to do some work to get from the efficient learning representation to the efficient reasoning representation. Although in this case, they'll actually line up okay. And the stuff I'm going to tell you about. Okay, so I have kind of a long story about this, which I'm going to zoom through, which has a bunch of straw men about how you might represent a world model, right? You could represent it as some just generic wad of neural network that maps images to images. Nobody likes that anymore. Maybe we learn a latent lower dimensional representation and we represent it as a transition model in that lower dimensional representation. That's better. I think not good enough. Maybe we factor, I have coding for new and old people here. So maybe we divide it up into chunks that have some independent meaning. That will give us already, just that gives us some leverage in planning, but not enough. So now let me get to the part that's actually gives us something, right? And that's factoring, right? So, and that's saying, oh, not only do I divide my state representation into chunks that are relatively independent of one another, I actually understand them in a model that's explicitly sparse. Sparse and local. So what I mean to say is that each factor, each chunk, maybe depends only a few factors from the previous time step, right? The world is like that, right? If I fling this remote at Michael, it's not going to change too much of the state of the room. It's certainly not going to change the state of whatever's going out there or Boston. Well, I guess maybe I could change the state in Boston by throwing something at Michael, but we won't worry about that too much. Okay. So we would like to find models that are sparse and local, where too many things don't change at once, where the dependencies are relatively sparse. And why? Well, because you get relatively much fewer parameters. You can maybe add a new factor and learn how it behaves independent of the other ones, right? So it starts to give us some of the representational tricks we'd like. And once you have a representation like this, you can leverage a bunch of tricks from the old-fashioned AI planning people that actually generally give you some substantial search-related speed up. Okay, my next favorite thing, also with two interpretations, old people will call it lifting, new people might call it slot-based, but whatever. We can look at the scene and understand it in terms of objects. Okay, so not only do I believe in like an external physical reality, I believe that at least it's a useful abstraction to think about it in terms of things. And the reason that it's useful to think about it in terms of things is because we can abstract over the particular things. So I'll show you how that can go. So imagine that I look at the scene, not my kitchen, and I understand it in terms of a bunch of objects. Okay, I hear already a little background job in some heads in the room. I can hear it saying, grr, there's no single unique decomposition of this domain into objects. And I know that, and it's true, but I will talk later again if I have time about how you can, given what you're trying to do in the world, decide using a kind of attention which of the objects in the world that you ought to pay attention to. So I don't think that's a problem. Okay, so we can think of the world in terms of objects. That means we can represent the factored state of the world. Now I can use the objects as dimensions in my factoring. We decided before factoring was useful, we can use objects as, you can think of them as indices into factored representations, where now we think about the world state in terms of properties of each of the individual objects. We can also think of it in terms of relationships between the objects or higher order relations between the objects and so on. But this is just another way of organizing a factored state space. All by itself, it doesn't help. But it begins to help when we start to think about the factored rules. And so, for instance, if I have a rule that says, oh, the way this object changes state is a function of its state and its relationship to some other things, and now I have a little neural network that says how this object changes state, then I have a piece of knowledge about how the world works that's generic, that can be applied to other objects, to other groups of objects in the scene, right? So if I want to reason that if I put this one piece of paper on top of this other piece of paper and I move the bottom paper, then the top one might move too, that's quite generic, right? It's not about these particular pieces of paper, but it's about objects in general. So I would like to be able to encode that kind of knowledge. And we can do that using a kind of symbolic representation, which I'm not going to dig into in detail. And I am going to call it a causal action model, right? So it's something that tells us the effects of our actions in the world in a way that's sparse. Those of you who care deeply about what it means to be causal, you should just ignore that word that I just said. We can call it predictive, and that's okay. We can talk about that later too if we want to. Okay, so these causal action models, what are they? And what do I wish we had? I'm going to say what we do have and what I wish we had. So I imagine that we can start out with an abstraction, a little bit, just a tiny bit of an abstraction, a few things that you want to say about the world. You know, maybe I want to get this object into my backpack or my thumb in my mouth or something, right? So some very basic distinctions in the world that measure properties I care about. Then, okay, this is where classic RL people come in. If I have some things in the world that I would like to be able to make true, like my remote's in my backpack or my thumb is in my mouth, RL can learn beautiful strategies for making those things true. Now, the trick is that they have to be kind of local and kind of limited and a little bit generic, right? So I don't want to learn a controller only for putting this backpack, this remote in my specific backpack, right? That would be a very specific thing, but maybe there's a kind of a general set of things that I can learn about maybe putting objects in other objects. It's also true that these controllers, RL people don't talk about this too much, but it's really important. And in the options world, we think about it maybe a little bit. If I say I would like to have a controller that's about putting my remote in my backpack, it shouldn't also involve purchasing the remote or manufacturing the plastic or all the other things that might be preconditions in some way to putting a remote in my backpack. So it has to be somehow constrained. Okay, so if I have some things I wish were true in the world, I can learn controllers to make them so. And then I can start to build these little abstract models of the controllers I have that say, oh, okay, well, this controller can make these things true in the world. I'm going to ignore the sampler thing for a minute. And then I can learn what has to be true. What's the preimage? What's the initiation set for the controller? I can learn that. And maybe I can learn that using predicates I already have, or maybe not, and maybe I need to learn new predicates. And if I need new predicates to describe what has to be true in order to make this thing happen, then I have some more controllers to learn. And then if I have more, so maybe there's this loop that we can make work. I have not done this whole loop. I will tell you about some pieces of it. Okay, in particular, I want to talk about this. So given a set of skills, we can learn causal action models from a small number of demonstrations. So this is, this particular demonstration is Nishant acting like a robot, sort of, but he's just doing some stuff. And here he's doing, these are demonstrations that are not meant to be replicated, as in learning from demonstration, but they're demonstrations that illustrate how some stuff happens in the world. So the assumption in this work, in this particular work I'm going to tell you about, is that we have skills already packaged up. either hand-built or learned using reinforcement learning, we have some ways of making things true. And these demonstrations are labeled by which controller is necessary to get from scene to scene. So that's kind of a big assumption. And they're also labeled with what that whole sequence was for. It doesn't have to be an optimal execution, but it has to be, I think, not totally ridiculous. We could talk about what that means later, too. So we get some demonstrations of how to do some stuff in the world. We don't learn a policy. What we do learn is a causal action model. That is to say, from these demonstrations, we learn something that explains how we can take actions, how we can use these actions to achieve things in very new situations, right? So our whole goal here is serious generalization. So I'll show you some more examples of this. But the idea is, from some demonstrations, learning how the world works, now given a totally new goal and a totally new scenario, use planning to decide how to behave. Okay. A quick discussion about how this works, because this is a kind of learning that I would guess most of you have not spent time thinking about. I know that some of you have, but maybe you haven't. So imagine that we have a bunch of demonstrations of stuff, of how the world works, and we get these state actions, state sequences. We can find all the ones that are about the same controller. We can think about, if we have predicates, right, we're assuming right now we have predicates. I'll talk about the predicate learning in a minute. So we assume we have predicates. The predicates, what do? They basically build an abstract representation of a state, right, by just looking at all the objects and seeing which predicates are true of those objects in the states that we have. So I can find the cases where, let's say, I did a push action. I can find the things that changed in virtue of doing that push action, because most of the stuff stays the same and we don't really care about it. I can do some clustering to find cases where we have the same effects, basically, from doing a push action, the same changes in the world. And I can lift. Now, I can do the thing I talked about before, which is, instead of now thinking about, oh, this action operates on this remote, I can think about actions that operate on, let's say, buttons in general. And I can go and do, in this case, some very simple Boolean function learning stuff to figure out what we think the preconditions are of this operation. So here we had, let's say, some operation for pushing a button. Black box, we don't know anything about it. We see that it quite frequently has a certain kind of effect in the world, and we figure out under what conditions it has that effect. We also learn samplers, which helps connect up with the actual physical geometric stuff, like where should you push a button if you're going to be pushing a button. Okay, that's fine, but it's all predicated on having predicates. That is to say, on having a way of carving up the world into these important symbolic relations between the objects. And where do we get the predicates? Okay. So what we can do is, what that algorithm I showed you before for learning operators, in the end, it will give you a set of operator descriptions, a set of causal action models that describes how the world works. But sometimes you get a terrible answer out. If the predicates are bad, right? If there's only one predicate that says I'm green, then you'll get a terrible, terrible predictive theory. But if you get really good predicates that carve the world at its joints, as the philosophers like to say, then you'll get a really lovely predictive theory. So I don't know what the right predicates are, but I do know that I can measure if I have a good set of predicates in terms of how predictive the theory is that I get out. So now I have a terrible outer loop problem of trying to find a set of predicates, a set of ways to carve the world so that I can learn a theory like this. We have a strategy for doing some hill climbing thing, but it requires having a kind of a pool of reasonably good ideas of what the predicates are. And that's been very hard to do until recently. And what we've been doing recently is using a VLM to give us some ideas. Okay, and I think, the VLM, you could think about the VLM as like just hearing other people talk about the world even gives you an idea of what the important distinctions are. So we take those demonstrations and we put them into a VLM, and we roughly just ask it, what are some predicates that you think would be good for describing this world, the relationships between the objects and the properties of the objects? And the VLM gives us the names in English, whatever, predicates, a whole bunch of them, some of them stupid, some of them helpful, lots of them. And not only does it give us the names, but of course, because it's a VLM, a vision language model, it's able to evaluate those predicates on a new scene. right? So we're going to use visual language model here for two things. We're going to use it as a perception engine, but also as a kind of a common sense, here's how it seems to be a good way to talk about how the world works engine. So the predicate, the VLM can generate these predicates. And then we do the loop of learning causal models using different versions of these predicate sets until we find one that's pretty good. Okay, so here's an example. Now, this robot was trained on the demonstrations in a different room. Let me see, actually, yeah, okay. And it was given about 6 demonstrations of the style that I showed you at the beginning of Nishant actually being the robot moving objects around. And now it has a goal of putting a can in the trash can, having the eraser end up in a bucket. The eraser actually starts in the bucket and wiping off the table. So that's the goal. And if we use a normal algorithm, it doesn't work very well. We're not just going to watch that. But here's our thing, right? So this is a totally new room, a totally new place. The robot hasn't seen this place before. But it's able to look around, see the objects it needs, do planning, right? So there it was a non-monotonic step in the sense that it had to dump the trash bin that had the eraser in it. The eraser's supposed to be in the trash bin, but it needs the eraser to wipe the table. So it dumped the bin to get the eraser out, and now it's wiping the table, and then it's going to go back and put the eraser in. So this is pretty, like, a little bit intricate, a little bit long horizon reasoning. Here's another demonstration that I think is pretty cool, which is a juicer. I didn't even know these things existed, but so, okay, this is a juice making machine. And it gets demonstrations, again, only a handful, and they're not all of doing the same part of the job, right? So in this case, this shows that the juicer's already set up with these 2 glasses underneath its spigots. And this demonstration shows some parts of what you have to do. It shows that you have to put the orange in the top and so on. It gets some other demonstrations that illustrate other aspects of what's necessary. And then we throw those demonstrations into this pipeline that I told you about, and it learns things. And like, here's an example of one of the causal action models that it learns. It's not perfect by a long shot. It has some extraneous properties in it, like it says the cups that you put the stuff in have to be plastic. Well, it didn't see any demonstrations of them not being plastic, and the VLM maybe assumed that that was required. But it learns a reasonable enough abstract model that we can totally use it in new circumstances. Notice that. Let me just point out a couple things. These names are names that the VLM came up with. And we evaluate these predicates by calling the VLM on a new scene. Right? So that's how that's working. But now the robot, given the demonstrations that you saw, now we're in again, a totally new place with different stuff. Not everything is on the table in front of it, but it goes over and it gets a fruit and puts it in the bin. And then it realizes that one of the receptacles, the receptacle the juice needs to go into, is not there. So it goes over and gets the receptacle and puts it in there. Okay, so this seems pretty good. Like planning can get us, I think, like into a realm of generality that it's pretty hard to get to by kind of like flat policy learning. All right, we're going to get juice eventually. We're not going to watch it. Okay, good. So I think we can pick representations of policies that give us sample efficiency by trying to learn causal models that are highly factored. Okay, I have 2 more points and then I'm out. One is learning can make planning better. Right, so everyone's favorite complaint. No, I don't know what everyone's favorite complaint about. There's 2 complaints about planning. One is you need models, and the other one is slow. Okay, so I think we can learn models. Let's talk about slow for a minute. So learning can make planning less slow in a whole bunch of ways, but I'm just going to talk about 2 that are not the normal 2 that people talk about. Okay, this is one of my favorite videos. You have to watch it carefully. Just watch it. I like it. Okay, pretty cool, right? So what makes it cool? So on the one hand, it's something, even if you were a pretty good bucket operator, you probably wouldn't have thought of, point 1. Point number 2 is, having seen it, you're like, oh, I can do that, right? Like, you can understand why it works. So, so this is actually an instance of a thing that was cool when I was a PhD student, which called explanation-based generalization. It's a way, it's an idea. The idea is, given an example can catalyze your inference. So maybe, if you're a really good bucket operator, you could have, in principle, come up with this trick. But computationally, very hard. But by seeing somebody do it, you're like, oh, that's a trick. That's a trick worth knowing. Okay, so we're trying to do some stuff like that. We're not as fancy as the bucket truck, but here's a robot given a demonstration of doing a thing. So I don't know, it picked up that thing and then it picked up the block, right? Okay, so this robot has kind of limited kinematics. It couldn't have picked up the block unless it had scooted it into its own little workspace, right? So you could say, all right, here's a trick, right? We saw this thing in terms of, in this case, a set of steps, right? It grabbed a tool, it used the tool to hook the object toward itself, it put the tool down, and then it grabbed the target. And so one of the things that we're working on is being able to see a demonstration, and again, not try to replicate the trajectories or anything like that, but just understand it in terms of some important sub-goals so that we can plan to do that more efficiently in the future. So we can learn the sub-goal sequence from a single demonstration. We have to do some practice to learn the samplers, to learn the stuff that picks the continuous parameters. But then, okay, then we can apply to new tools without training our object models. And critically, now that we have this new operation, which is like scoot something closer to you, when we're planning at an abstract level, we can think of the robot really as having a bigger reach, right? We have a new operator, which is all packed up, just like picking something, which is called pick by scooting it toward you. And then you can use that in plans. And you can, scoot one thing toward you to scoot another thing toward you and so on. So we get this productive compositionality. And what we find is the tall blue thing is how long it would have taken to try to infer how to do this. You could do it eventually, in this case, 10 minutes for a very simple problem. Having seen one demonstration of it and a little bit of practice, we can do it very quickly. And actually, by reasoning additionally about the geometry, we can make it even more efficient. So stuff can be made efficient, I think. Another idea about how to make things efficient is a strategy for taking really big problems and making them small, right? So, you had to get to Edmonton, most of you, from somewhere far away. That's kind of a big problem. You had to ignore most of what you know about the world in order to just focus on that for a while. So the question of how it is that you can take a huge problem of your life and turn it into something small enough to reason about is a big thing. And I think we want to use maybe RL to learn metacognitive strategies that take the big problem we're trying to solve in our life right now and map them into small enough problems that we can address in our small brain. An example, just a quick example of this, is some work we did on learning what objects are relevant, right? So you might say, oh, here I am in a very complicated world. Maybe not just a complicated scene, but a complicated mental state about how everything is going on in the world. I have a thing I'm trying to do at the moment. Can I very quickly constitute a tiny subdomain that's sufficient so that if I plan in that subdomain and get a plan out, it's actually a decent solution to the problem that I'm trying to solve. So we did that in some simple first discrete problems, and it worked great. And then even in some continuous robot problems where there's a lot of stuff in the world, but the robot's able to figure out, actually, there's only a few of these objects, so they're really critical to its thinking about what to do. Okay, one more idea at the high level. Okay, that was learning can make planning better. Now, planning can make learning better. Planning can make learning better? Okay, so here's one idea. Well, okay, so in classical reinforcement learning, people worry a ton about exploration. But I think there's something kind of really not ideal about the exploration strategies that are typical in reinforcement learning, partly because they're mixed in with everything else that we're doing at the same time. So reinforcement learning is a miracle in a way, right? Because it's doing dynamic programming at the same time it's doing function approximation, at the same time it's doing some statistical averaging. Okay, it can do all those things. And then we add exploration in there too, and we add some extra fake rewards for going here and there, and then they're supposed to like fall away after a while or something. And it's all mixed together, which is on the one hand beautiful because we have only one mechanism, but on the other hand, I think it just makes things harder. Okay, so I'm going to advocate that exploration is a really important thing, but maybe it shouldn't be just stirred into our value functions. Maybe it could be a separate mechanism. Okay, so here's one idea of a separate mechanism. This method here is called glib, goal literal babbling. It was actually inspired by Josh Tenenbaum, a colleague from cognitive science, who loves saying, oh, well, kids, if you look at kids, they're always like, I wonder if I could stand on top of this table, or I wonder what would happen if I poured water on Michael's head, or, I don't know. Well, poor Michael, I keep using him as a scapegoat, but there he is. I wonder if, I wonder if I could do that. If you could pick targets that are just a little out of reach and try to reach them, you can learn a lot from that, right? That's kind of a principle of education in general. And so if you're learning causal action models, you can kind of build a cycle where you say, all right, I have some data so far. I'm going to build a model of what I can do in the world. I'm going to say, I wonder if I could do that. And then I'm going to make a plan to try to do it. And we'll see what happens. And fundamentally, the idea is, so we pick a goal that's in our vocabulary. We try to make a plan to achieve the goal using our current model of how the world works. We execute the plan. If it works, well, actually, that's a little disappointing. If it doesn't work, then we learn something about the world. If we can't make a plan, then we have to kind of relax our current model and be a little more optimistic. But this strategy lets us reach a lot farther than doing more local kinds of exploration. And it gives us really good feedback on the places where our theories are not good. And graphs go up. Okay, I'm going to show one more example and then stop talking. All right, so this is one more example of using planning to improve learning. Okay, so here we have a robot. It has a set of parameterized skills already built in. It knows the distribution of tasks, but it's not very good. The skills aren't very tuned up. So imagine the scenario where I just delivered a robot to your house, and it kind of knows how to do some stuff, but it doesn't know the details of your house very well or how to do things locally. It has some free time, and it decides to practice. So now it's going to deliberately pick some skills to practice more, maybe to get more RL training. In our case, it's to get more, to tune up a sampler for how we pick the continuous parameters in a fixed low-level skill. And then it's going to plan, using the skills that it has, to put the world in a state that will allow it to practice. So this is planning for resetting, basically. And what's interesting is what skills it decides to practice. It decides to practice skills that it thinks it can still improve at, that it's not ideal, right? So those are the two important things. Okay, so I'm just going to talk through a movie now. So here's an example. This is a Spot robot. This work was done at what's now called RAI, the Boston Dynamics AI Institute, by some of my students and some people there. So a robot comes in, and as I said, it kind of already knows how to do some stuff. It's asked to put the toys in the bin. It decides to move the little chair out of the way and come and pick up the broom. It figures it can sweep the objects in one go. Maybe that's a good way to do this problem. But then we discover it doesn't work. Okay, because I don't know, the friction is different on the little table. So now the people have gone to bed. The robot's downstairs. It's nighttime. It's whacking around in the basement. It says, okay, I got to be better at this so that the people aren't mad at me tomorrow morning. And so I want to practice this sweeping thing. Oh, well, okay, that wasn't very good. Okay, but now it plans to reset the world into a situation that will allow it to try again. So it's doing its own deliberate practice. And it ran for several hours here, totally autonomously with some battery changes only, in order to tune up its samplers. And so that's good, right? It's not exploring like this, it's exploring in this kind of reasonably deliberate way. Okay, are we done now, Spot? Maybe in a minute. Okay. So good, so now next morning, we'll just watch this finish and then we'll stop and talk. Okay, so now next morning we say, okay, Spot, put the toys in the bin. The objects could have been in different places. This movie would have been better if we had moved stuff around. It wouldn't matter. Okay, now the moment of truth, has it learned? So it's basically learned how much force to apply. And it did. That was good. Okay, those of you who have ever watched the Shaky the Robot movie, remember Charlie the Gremlin. And if you haven't watched it, you should watch it, and then you'll get this joke retroactively. But okay, so here's Spot. It's trying to do the thing it was trying to do. It's just about to do the thing it needs to do, except for Nishant now, the gremlin, comes and messes it up. And it messes it up actually pretty badly, right? So it's supposed to get all the toys in the bin, and now that toy is up there on the shelf. And Spot is like, uh-oh, this is hard. But it calls the planner and says, well, can I put the operations I have together in a way that will let me solve this problem? It had previously understood that it could move things around and climb on them, so it knows that it can climb on the platform. So it climbs on the platform to get the object. Okay, no learning, just planning. Okay, yay, go Spot. All right, so there's a ton of stuff to do, right? I think uncertainty quantification is a really important thing that I really care about at the kind of frontier of research right now. If I'm going to have a policy that knows what to do some of the time, then it also needs to know when it knows what to do, so that when it doesn't know what to do, I can call the planner. Memory systems is something that we worry a ton about, right? We don't just look at the scene in front of us and decide what to do, but we have to remember what's going on in the world. I have an old YouTube rant right now called "The Last 4 Frames is Not All You Need," which tries to capture some of that. Okay, so I want to engineer general purpose rational robots in this way and use all the tools in the toolbox, right? Don't fixate too much on a particular set of techniques because that's what you do or what this community does or something like that, but just really think about every possible thing that could maybe help solve the problems. Okay, I have one funny reinforcement learning story. This is a slide that I made back in the day when the way you made slides was to write on pieces of plastic with colored markers. There was a day, some of us were there, and I was operating completely in a vacuum, me personally, and I came up with this thing which I called the stupidest possible learning behavior. That turned out to have been a big mistake because when I gave this talk, a person who invented something like this was in the audience, and he was really not pleased. But anyway, so I had this thing. I called it pleasure, though, which was better than reinforcement learning. So I was just working on myself. And then I submitted it to a thing called ICML. I had been rejected before. They wouldn't let me even attend. But I submitted this paper, and I accepted, but I got this review back that said, well, this is kind of interesting, but actually, you don't know what you're talking about. Roughly, that's what the review said. And I said, I should get to know who this person is, because obviously they know about this problem that I'm just messing around in, and it turned out to be Rich. So that's how I got to know Rich, and he was on my committee, so yay. So that's my funny RL story. With that, I will thank my students and colleagues and invite questions. So thank you.